to start the
You're good.
PowerPoint, but I can give a little bit of background first just
For
about the
sh-
Cornwall Alliance.
yeah.
Um, the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a network, really, of just under 70 evangelical Christian scholars. About a third of them are natural scientists, including physicists, chemists, geologists, biologists, meteorologists, climatologists, and so on. About a third are economists, most of them with special emphasis in either developmental economics, the economics of how whole societies rise and stay out of poverty, or environmental economics, that is, how we can use the lessons of economics, the principles of economics to help us figure out the best ways for us to be good stewards of the earth. Um, we often sort of summarize our aim by saying that it is to help people understand what it means and how to fulfill the mandate that God gave to mankind in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and everything that moves on the face of the earth. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the environmentalist movement tends to be quite hostile to that. One of the so-called four laws of ecology that Barry Commoner put together in his book back in the 1960s that really shaped the movement was that nature is best untouched by human hands. And therefore, if we really care about the natural world, we should be doing all that we can to minimize our environmental footprint, to minimize our impact on the earth. I don't think that is consistent with Genesis 1:28, which tells us that we are supposed to fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over everything in it. But neither, of course, should we be just simply paving it all over with Walmart parking lots or burning everything up or anything like that. Our dominion over the earth, I believe, should reflect God's own dominion. And we learn about that to start with in the first 25 verses of Genesis, where God starts with nothing and he makes everything. He starts with darkness and makes light. Darkness and light then later on in scripture are figurative for ignorance and knowledge or truth, darkness for falsehood. He starts with chaos and brings order. He starts with no life and brings life, and then great abundance of life. And he tells every sort of life to be fruitful and multiply and fill its niche in the overall world, the ecosystems of the world. And so, in light of that, because we are made in God's image, we believe that our dominion should reflect His. And well, how do we do that? By seeking to enhance the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and to the benefit of our neighbors. So if we put it that way, frankly, I haven't found anybody who has objected much to that as certainly the goal. The devil, of course, is in the details of how to reach that goal. You know, how do we actually achieve that? And that's where there's a lot of work to be done in science and in economics and in various subsets of those two. But we try to bring a biblical worldview together with excellent science and economics to address these issues. One very shorthand way of saying what we're doing is that we're trying to save the planet from the people who are trying to save the planet. Uh, and if you understand how anti-human a great deal of the environmental movement is, you'll see why that makes sense. So the PowerPoint, Don, or the lecture, Don, that you have asked me to go through is on understanding and responding to climate change, the challenge of doing that, And if you're ready to me, I'll go ahead and share that PowerPoint and we'll work through that.
Yeah,
All right.
excellent. And the recording of this conversation will also be available, and a copy of the PowerPoint as well, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
And I
Let's
turn it
see
over
here.
to you.
All right. So are you seeing my screen now then?
We are.
A slide, creation, stewardship, faithful fulfillment of the dominion or cultural mandate,
Yeah.
the challenge of understanding and responding to climate change. Now, I'm not an expert at how to do these things, and I'm seeing that, there we go. I can get that out of the way. Here we go. I can minimize it too. Okay. All
Calvin,
right.
where are you
So
located? Where are you located before you start?
I live just outside of Memphis, Tennessee, and oh my goodness, the copy editor in me just noticed my typo here in leaving the I out of understanding. Oh, shame on me. Oh well, such is life. All right, so we want to dive into this, and first I want to make a reading recommendation. This is for the book Climate and Energy: The Case for Realism. I co-edited this with Dr. David R. Legates, who is Cornwall Alliance's Director of Research and Education. Dr. Legates is a recently retired professor and now is emeritus professor of climatology at the University of Delaware. He had about a 40-year career in climatology and meteorology, teaching most of the time at Delaware, but also at Louisiana State and at the University of Oklahoma. He is a major statistician on weather and climate-related matters, and just wonderful to have him with us. We have 16 different authors for this book, 16 chapters. There are 9 climate scientists, including some of the world's very top climate scientists. We have energy engineers, energy economists, environmental economists, and I just think this is a book that many people interested in this subject would want to read. It's a fat book, 464 pages, plus intro pages and that sort of thing. But it's a book that, though it's written by top-notch experts, excellent scientists and economists and the like, we insisted that they all write for lay people. And in fact, every chapter starts with a one-page long summary that makes the basic findings of that chapter clear and simple for non-specialists to understand. This is available at Cornwall Alliance's online store at cornwallalliance.org/shop. So now, the challenge that we face really is to try to combine biblical worldview, theology, and ethics with excellent science, economics, and politics. So I'm going to start off with some foundational observations here. And the first one is this. We begin right at Genesis 1:1 and 31. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, we need to ask ourselves the question, what does this imply about Earth's climate system? Is it more likely robust, resilient, and self-correcting? Or is it prone to catastrophic results from relatively minor perturbations? We'll get back to that question a little bit later when we consider the issue of just how much change there's actually been in atmospheric chemistry because of our burning fossil fuels and making concrete and raising cattle and using nitrous fertilizers and the like. The changes to atmospheric chemistry can be presented to sound very big, but in reality, they're quite tiny. if we're told that we have increased CO2 content in the atmosphere by roughly 50% from the pre-industrial revolution period, that sounds big. When we are reminded that what actually we've done is bring it from about 27 or 28 thousandths of 1% to about 42 thousandths of 1%, suddenly it doesn't sound quite that drastic. The second part of our foundational thinking is to see what the Lord said to himself following the flood. I will never again curse the ground on account of man. For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. This is an example of a poetic device called merism, in which opposite ends of a spectrum are used to sort of say, yeah, those and everything in between. And there are four opposite ends of spectrums here: seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. And the gist of what we should get from this is that God has promised to himself that he will ensure that the various cycles, particularly the weather cycles, the climate cycles on which life on this earth depends, he will sustain those. So what has he promised to himself regarding the cycles on which life depends, and how does that compare with the fears that are being generated about human-induced climate change? The third foundation, the Lord says to himself, again, after the flood, here in Genesis 9 through 11, now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with every living creature, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. We might ask ourselves, is catastrophic sea level rise, not just sea level rise, but catastrophic sea level rise due to man-made global warming, likely when God has promised never again to destroy the earth with a flood? A fourth foundational starting point. We read in Mark chapter 4 of this time when the disciples took Jesus along with them in the boat, and there arose a fierce gale of wind. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, be still. And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? They became very much afraid and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? And who, we might ask ourselves, controls the winds and the waves? Now, what's really behind climate catastrophism? And we will get into some other things later that I think are behind it. But I think we start in Jeremiah chapter 5, this fascinating passage. And there's much more in Jeremiah 5 that's related to this, but just these verses, 21 through 25, say, Now hear this, O foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but do not see, who have ears but do not hear. Do you not fear me, declares the Lord, Yahweh? Do you not tremble in my presence? For I have placed the sand as a boundary for the sea, an eternal decree, so it cannot cross over it. Though the waves toss, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, yet they cannot cross over it. Now, we might wonder, well, just exactly how precise is that boundary? But at least we find there some reference to a boundary that God has placed on the sea. But he continues now. This people has a stubborn and rebellious heart. They have turned aside and departed. They do not say in their heart, Let us now fear the Lord our God, who gives rain in its season, both the autumn rain and the spring rain, who keeps for us the appointed weeks of the harvest. Your iniquities have turned these away, and your sins have withheld good from you. This is, I think, a very important text for us. The tremendous fears of climate change, but lots of other things in life, arise largely, I believe, because people don't fear the Lord. If we feared God, we would need fear nothing else. So I think that partly the forgetfulness of God, and especially the lack of the fear of the Lord, stands behind the, I think, excessive fears of climate change that are all around us. That is partly because in forgetting God, we don't apply biblical worldview to the scientific and other issues that confront us in this field. Well, does all of that mean, well, okay, we're not responsible? We can just go ahead and do whatever we please with no concerns about the impact on God's world? No, I don't think so. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth," says Genesis 1:26 through 28. God intends human dominion over the earth to be complete. Nothing on land or in the sea or in the air is excluded. And where there is dominion, there is responsibility. That's what makes us stewards, not sovereigns, over this world. We have dominion, but it is a subordinate dominion, subordinate to God, and we are responsible to him. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it, says Genesis 2:15. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over it and everything in it," as we've seen. This is what we're called to do. And unfortunately, a lot of the evangelical creation care movement, I think, makes some important mistakes in how it handles these two passages. It goes especially to Genesis 2:15, and it will retranslate the Hebrew behind cultivate and keep that you see here. Keep might also be translated guard. They'll retranslate to something like serve and worship. And then they'll say, okay, so we're supposed to serve the earth, but of course they're going to be pretty hesitant to say that we should worship the earth. So some of them will then say, well, but that worship there, what's supposed to be worshipped is God, which is a plausible idea, but the pronominal suffix on the Hebrew word translated keep or guard or possibly worship, the pronominal suffix on that is feminine. God is not feminine. Elohim is masculine and always addressed that way. Now, the word for garden that is used there is usually feminine, but sometimes it is masculine. And you can look at various Hebrew lexicons to find that out. Since the pronominal suffix is feminine, it's pretty clear that this doesn't refer to worshiping God. It refers to doing something toward the garden, and that would be to guard it, to keep it. And then we're also to cultivate it, or now, the word there from Hebrew, the word is avad, is sometimes translated as serve rather than cultivate or work. But again, if you go to the Hebrew lexicons, it appears that it is to be translated serve only when its object, its grammatical object, is personal, not when the grammatical object is impersonal.
I get it.
Am I missing something that I need to attend to here? I'm hearing a voice. Okay, I assume not. Okay, so what we're told in Genesis 2:15 is that mankind is to cultivate and guard the garden. But remember, garden is only at that point a very tiny part of the earth. Its geographic boundaries are described in chapter 2 earlier in the chapter, and out of it flow 4 rivers to water the earth. And so outside the garden is the area into which man is to go from the garden to fill that earth and subdue it. So the picture we get is of a garden that is already subdued, but the rest of the earth needing to be subdued, and man is to multiply and fill that earth and subdue it and rule over it, bring it under dominion, so that it becomes more like the garden. This is why, for instance, I titled one of my books back in the mid-1990s, Where Garden Meets Wilderness. Because in the scriptures, I believe that we learn that part of man's assigned task is to move out from the garden and transform wilderness into garden, bringing more and more of the earth under full dominion. Now, we do need to address this question that, as I mentioned, Barry Commoner called one of the 4 laws of God, of ecology, that nature is best untouched by human hands. Is that really the case, biblically? Well, Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 34 say this: I passed by the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense, and behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. When I saw it, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Well, then your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. Of all of God's creatures on this earth, man is the only one made in God's image, and mankind is to take priority over all others. That doesn't mean that we are to destroy all others. It doesn't mean that we are to abuse all others, but it does mean that providing for human needs is a higher priority than providing for any other needs. And what we learn is that in order to provide for human needs, we need to transform the natural world into something different, to the ruled world, so to speak. Let me put it this way. Hunting and gathering would support no more than 1 or 2 people per square mile in the very best tropical paradise. Today, there are over 300 people per square mile on all of the habitable land of the earth. And therefore, of course, hunting and gathering could not support that many. We must use agriculture. And in fact, we cannot depend just on mere subsistence agriculture without extreme mechanization and the like, because even that could not support more than perhaps a dozen or so people per square mile. We need much more productive agriculture, and that productive agriculture requires that there be much industrial activity as well. So, a quick review here of biblical foundations. From Genesis 1:31, God's good creation, I think, stands against anthropogenic global warming catastrophism. Will raising CO2 concentration from 27 or 28 thousandths of 1% to 54 thousandths of 1% cause climate catastrophe? What would that imply about God's wisdom? Let me give you an analogy. Suppose I'm an architect and I design a building so that all of the feedback mechanisms in its structure would multiply the stress of my weight leaning against a wall over and over and over again, exponentially indeed, so that ultimately the whole building would collapse because I lean against that wall. Would you call me a brilliant architect? or a fool. Well, I think that's the case with anthropogenic global warming catastrophism, because all of the predictions of dangerous to catastrophic warming from human emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases depend on the assumption that the overall effect of the many, many different feedback mechanisms that are part of the climate system, which, by the way, is probably the most complicated natural system we've ever studied, with the exception of the human brain and DNA. The assumption is that the net effect of all of the feedback mechanisms in the climate system is positive, very strongly positive, which is what is necessary to wind up with what Al Gore has called runaway feedback effect. That's an assumption that we will discuss a little bit later, that has been falsified by comparison of computer models of climate change versus actual real-world observations. Genesis 1:28 says that we are supposed to have dominion, and that is contrary to the nature is best untouched by human hands notion. Should we think, based on that, that mankind should minimize our ecological, including our carbon footprint? I don't think so. Genesis 8:22, God is faithful, and he has promised that the cycles on which life depends, he will sustain. Psalm 104, 5 through 9, God has promised that he has set boundaries to the sea. We saw the same thing in Jeremiah chapter 5, versus catastrophic sea level rise, fears of that. And then finally, this is one that I didn't mention before, but in Galatians 2:10, Paul wrote that when he first went to visit the apostles in Jerusalem, the one thing he asked them to do was to remember the poor. And he said, which I was already committed to doing. And I believe that the policies being promoted to fight global warming, to mitigate human-induced climate change, that those policies almost unanimously slow, stop, or reverse the climb out of poverty for the developing countries of the world, and will push millions of people, even billions of people in the developed world, back into poverty. And poverty is a far greater risk to human health and longevity than anything related to climate. If you have income equivalent to, say, the bottom 5% of Americans, you can thrive in any climate, from the Arctic Circle to the Brazilian rainforest to the Amazon desert. But if you're trying to eke by on the equivalent of $2 a day, you can't thrive in the best tropical paradise. And so it's very important that we always be thinking, what are the trade-offs here? If we adopt this or that policy, what are the unintended consequences of that? And in many cases, pretty much all cases, I think the unintended consequences are devastating to the world's poor. All right, so let's get into some of the science about climate change. And I want to first tell you that what climate scientists actually know may not be what you think they know. If you've been following, mainstream media, legacy media, if you've been following politicians' pronouncements and so on, for instance, President Obama's claim about a decade ago or so that 97% of all scientists agree that global warming is real, that it is man-made, that it is a crisis. You may think that scientists know a lot more about the climate and climate change than they really do. But Judith Curry, who was a contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for many years early on, and finally left it because she thought that it was basically corrupt. She was the professor of atmospheric science and chair of the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech for many, many years. In her book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, Rethinking Our Response, which came out in 2023, she said, here are the incontrovertible facts about global warming. First, average global surface temperatures have overall increased since about 1860. Second, carbon dioxide has infrared emission spectra and thus acts to warm the planet. Third, humans have been adding CO2 to the atmosphere via emissions from burning fossil fuels. There is no significant disagreement, she says, in the scientific community on these points. But what climate scientists don't know may be what you think they know, because these are the kinds of claims that are made over and over again, but are in fact not well supported by any empirical evidence. So Curry goes on to say, however, these three facts, either individually or collectively, do not tell us much about the most consequential issues associated with climate change. First, whether and to what extent carbon dioxide and other human-caused emissions have dominated over natural climate variability as the cause of recent warming. In other words, how much of the warming that's taken place has really been driven by CO2 and other greenhouse gases versus how much of it is natural, how much of it is just part of natural cycles. We simply don't know. Now, the answer could be, oh, human-caused emissions have caused all of it. Or it could be they've caused none of it. Most likely it's, well, they've caused some of it. But the opinions among scientists who focus on this range all the way from none to everything and tend to sort of congregate toward the middle. Second, how much the climate can be expected to change over the 21st century. There's plenty of disagreement among that, and I'll show you some models later that give different ideas about that. And then we'll also question the reliability of the models because they differ so much from real-world observation. Third, whether warming is dangerous. Now, isn't that fascinating? We're constantly told that global warming or climate change, human-induced climate change particularly, is a catastrophe, a crisis. President Biden and various others have called it an existential threat. But Judith Curry is telling us the scientists themselves don't have any clear answer to the question of whether warming is dangerous. And then finally, she points out that the scientists don't really have a good answer to the question of whether radically reducing CO2 emissions will improve human well-being in the 21st century. Now, if that differs from what you think you hear typically in the legacy media and from politicians, well, you've been paying attention, and it certainly does. All right, so there are various scare tactics that are used to promote fears of global warming and thus to build public support for various different climate policies. For instance, back in 2001, Time magazine put on its cover this picture, this illustration of the Earth as the yolk of an egg in a frying pan, and illustrated global warming with that. Just by the way, for fun, I might point out, eggs start to fry at 158 degrees Fahrenheit. Average global temperature is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Rising at 0.29 degrees per decade, which is the University of Alabama at Huntsville satellite rate measured from 1979 to October 24, 2024. That, by the way, is the most reliable means we have of establishing global average temperature. Rising at 29 hundredths of a degree per decade, it would take 3,379 years to make the egg fry. Okay, in 2021, BBC News had this headline, Climate Change IPCC report is code red for humanity, that was quoting the UN Secretary General. Uh, um, his name escapes me. But it was quoting him upon the release of the sixth version of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's scientific assessment report on climate change. What's ironic is you can go through that entire scientific assessment report and you will never find words like crisis or catastrophe or existential threat, let alone the phrase code red for humanity. Indeed, in the scientific reports themselves, they're really quite moderate. It's the summaries for policymakers, which are not produced by the scientists, but by government representatives from I believe it's 194 different countries that are members of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which the IPCC works. Their summaries for policymakers put a bit of scary language in, but not an awful lot. It's in press releases and news conferences that you hear the really crisis-oriented language. And then finally, of course, a couple of years ago, President Biden called climate change an existential threat. Well, how do we get such scary ideas? Here's one way. In 2018, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration scared people with this temperature graph, and it has been reproduced hundreds of times in all kinds of different websites and in political reports and whatnot. This purportedly shows global land and ocean temperature anomalies, January through December, from 1880 to 2018. And you notice the nice, cool, comfortable blue temperatures for cold, and the hot red, alarming temperatures, colors rather, for the warmer. This is, by the way, anomalies, that is, differences from the 20th century average or median. Now, that really looks pretty scary. And that's a classic example of how to propagandize with data. Now, let me ask you this. Did you notice the extent of the vertical axis on that last one? You could have noticed if you had looked closely, but most people don't. But the vertical axis is a grand total of 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. You might barely feel that if you went from one room to another, but it's certainly not huge. So if this were drawn on a different vertical axis, there might be a little bit of a different impact on people who look at it. Now, also, those colors are important. This is exactly the same data drawn on the same vertical axis, but without the alarming colors. Doesn't look quite so scary, does it? But frankly, that vertical axis is quite unrealistic. When we graph data, we should put it on scales that are relevant to ordinary life, to the sort of life and affairs that we think are affected by whatever it is that we're graphing. Well, here are exactly the same numbers graphed on a vertical scale of 17 degrees Celsius or 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Why did I choose that? Because that's a pretty common range from nighttime low to daytime high in typical situations all over the world. Notice what happens here. No more angry red color, no more, cool blue color. And suddenly, the trend is there. It's recognizable, but it no longer looks nearly so frightening. It's very important that we learn as consumers of data to distinguish between data that is presented in an objective, realistic way and data that is presented in a propagandistic way. Now, just for fun, I put the exact same numbers on a vertical scale in degrees Kelvin, going from absolute zero to, well, 327 degrees is where the line is there, but the hottest temperature ever measured on Earth, therefore, near surface air temperature, was 330 degrees Kelvin in Death Valley, California on July 10 of 1913. And if we put those numbers on this scale, well, I defy you to detect any upward trend in that. Now, that, frankly, is itself not realistic because we don't all live constantly on this Kelvin scale where, you know, a difference of a few degrees is invisible. But that's just an illustration of how you could actually do the opposite with those numbers. All right, here's another scare tactic. The legacy media, Weather Channel and various others such, are really good at trumpeting heat waves and making us think that those are really, really dreadful. And recently, by the way, it's become increasingly common for them to present them as if somehow they were unprecedented. So here is how fair and balanced Fox News weather presented weather maps in the middle of June of 2024, focusing on the heat waves of the Great Lakes region and the Midwest. And you'll notice dark red, an angry looking color, dangerous looking, right? This is a classic way of doing this sort of thing. So this is what they showed of forecast highs and potential record highs for that area at that time. Now, this is what they didn't show at fair and balanced Fox News. What they didn't show was that heat wave area over there to the northeast United States, eastern Canada, was balanced out by a cold area over to the west of the US and Canada. And they'll constantly describe the heat waves as climate change induced. But everything else is just weather. Well, that's not exactly a very honest way of presenting things. Now, Chris Martz, a meteorologist, actually presented this slide, which I have shown you here. He presented that and he explained it this way. Anyone who has passed a high school physics course understands Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action, there will be an equal and opposite reaction. Any area of, quote, unusual, unquote, warmth is going to be balanced by an area of, quote, unusual, unquote, cold. The 2-meter air temperature anomaly, i.e. the departure from average, map for the last 5 days, the period shown there, conveys this quite well. The upper plains and Canadian prairies have been averaging generally some 6 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit below average, while the Great Lakes, Ontario, Quebec, and New England have been 6 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit above the 1991 to 2020 average. The entire map area anomaly, half a degree Fahrenheit. If the entire map were colored according to that value, what color would it be? White. While slightly above average, yes, it's not at all significant. But did you know that Western North America is quite cool relative to average of late? No. Why? Because the news media would rather fixate on the heat wave in the eastern US and southeastern Canada to spread fear over typical summer weather. That's essentially what it boils down to. Now, also, while we're being warned constantly about the danger of increased heat waves because of climate change, we're not reminded that the same should bring reduced cold snaps. Now, cold kills 10 to 20 times as many people per day as does heat. Therefore, since I mean, if if heat waves increased just as much as cold snaps diminished, we would have a net net unchanged human mortality due to temperatures. But however, greenhouse gas-driven warming happens mainly toward the poles in winter at night, which means that it raises low temperatures much more than it raises high temperatures. And the result is a large net reduction in heat waves, in cold snaps, and not a significant change in heat waves. And the result of that is a large net reduction in temperature-related deaths. So why doesn't that get reported in the news talking about the dangers of climate change? Well, here's a third scare tactic. We're told that climate change is bringing on more extreme weather. And we'll go back here to earlier this summer when Hurricane Beryl was, we're told that this was the earliest hurricane, Category 5 hurricane detected in the Atlantic on all record. And BBC runs the headline, Hurricane Beryl, record-breaking sign of a warming world. Sign of a warming world. It wasn't enough just to say that this was record-breaking, as in the earliest Category 5 hurricane shown, but to say that it was a sign of a warming world. Mark Pointing, their climate reporter, said, Hurricane Beryl is wreaking havoc in parts of the Caribbean and putting the role of climate change under the spotlight. With maximum sustained winds of more than 160 miles per hour, it became the earliest Category 5 Atlantic hurricane in records going back around 100 years. In fact, there has only been one previous recorded case of a Category 5 Atlantic hurricane in July, Hurricane Emily on 16 July of 2005. Well, what are we to think of that? Notice that this is by a climate reporter, Mark Pointing. His qualifications? Well, he has a master's not in climatology, but in polar studies, glaciology and geology, and a bachelor's in geography. And he seems to neglect the fact that weather is not climate. Weather is what happens locally over the span of a few days or weeks. Climate is average weather over 30 years or more, and in large regions of the globe as a whole. Hurricanes are not climate. Now we go to Dr. Roy W. Spencer, who did his Ph.D. dissertation on hurricanes. He's a principal research scientist in climate at the University of Alabama at Huntsville. He's a NASA award winner. He's also a board member of the Cornwall Alliance and a senior fellow of ours since we began almost 20 years ago. And he says, look, there are records and then there are records. He says, I have a question about Hurricane Beryl being the earliest Atlantic Cat 4, Cat 5 hurricane on record. If this same storm occurred 100 years ago, in 1924, would it have been documented as a Cat 4 or Cat 5? No, because the data did not exist, and it was located in the middle of nowhere. Ships of opportunity would have sailed around it or been sunk. And there were years when dozens of ships were sunk by hurricanes 500 years ago, but no one really knows their intensity. Frankly, we have no idea whether there were Cat 5 hurricanes before late July in the Atlantic prior to basically the satellite era, which began in the 1960s. Now, does global warming increase hurricanes? First off, GHG-induced warming happens mainly toward the poles in winter at night, not toward the equator in summer and daytime. Therefore, it reduces the temperature gradient between equator and poles, the difference in temperature between them. Now, the function of hurricanes in Earth's climate system is to move heat from equator to poles. They're basically a great heat engine. Reduced temperature gradient results in fewer or weaker hurricanes, or both. And the observation that we have in the real world? Well, the empirical data show no increase in the frequency or intensity of hurricanes, or frankly, any other extreme weather, floods, droughts, heat waves, cold snaps, wildfires, tornadoes, etc., during potentially anthropogenic global warming. This is a graph of what is called accumulated cyclone energy index, running from 1981 or early 81 through 2024. It's kept up by Ryan Mawa. And the number of hurricanes, all hurricanes, shows no upward trend, indeed a slight downward trend over that period. And the major hurricanes, again, no trend. There are ups and downs, but no trend. Similarly, for accumulated cyclone energy, the previous graph was on numbers of hurricanes. This measures intensity. And here we have the intensity for all versus the intensity for the extreme ones. There's no trend in any of this. Okay, but there's another scare tactic. Hey, we're all going to drown, right? Al Gore, in his Inconvenient Truth movie in 2006, showed at the top left the effect of, or I'm sorry, at both top and bottom left. In 2006, a satellite photo of Florida showing its coastline and whatnot. And in the bottom part, it shows what would be the effect on Florida of a 20-foot rise in sea level. Now, he didn't give any time frame there. So let's think about this a little bit. Average sea level rise rate from 1900 to the present was about 1.8 millimeters per year. There has been no observed acceleration. There have been computer models that have predicted acceleration, but there has in fact been no observed acceleration in that long-term rate of sea level rise. In fact, the best evidence is for deceleration since the mid-20th century. How long would it take to raise sea level 20 feet? 6,096 years. I'm sorry, not 6,096 years, but 3,387 years. I was misreading my script here. That's one way of putting it. That's 6,096 millimeters divided by 1.8 millimeter per year is 3,387 years. Or another way to calculate would be a 20-foot rise in sea level equals 8 to 34 times the full range of 110-year projections for sea level rise in the IPCC's 2007 report. In other words, it would take 880 to 3,740 years to achieve that. Now, anybody who thinks that the Earth's average temperature is not going to decline sometime over the next 3,000 years, or even over the next 880 years, is not familiar with global temperature history. All right, but there's another scare tactic, and that's CO2. CO2, it is a scary thing. We're told that CO2 must increase global average temperature, and it's going to be bad. Well, this figure, which comes, well, let me just go through this. The solid red line here gives us the average of all fifth-generation climate models used by the UN IPCC and various governments around the world. The thin colored lines are the averages of individual fifth-generation model groups. The solid figures there, the blue squares, the sort of purplish squares, and the green circles, those solid figures are from weather balloon, satellite, and reanalysis data for the tropical troposphere. Those are actual real-world observation. And only one of the 32 model groups runs correctly simulates what has been observed. You can see that where I'm pointing right here. See that right there? Okay. That is reasonably close. It's the only one of those 32 model groups that correctly simulates what has been observed. It's the Russian model INM-CM4, which has the least progressive warming. Now, sound science would use that model, not the average of all the models, which exceed observations by 2 to 3 times. But the IPCC and most others use the average instead. This is the text here is adapted from Pat Michaels and John Christie's chapter, Climate Models and Scientific Method, in our book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism. Now, you might think that the models have gotten better over time. After all, that was quite a while ago, the 5th generation. Now we're on the 6th generation. Well, no, they haven't. In fact, they're a little worse now. They depart farther from the real world observations. The solid red line is the average of all the CMIP 6 models. The thin colored lines are their model groups. And the solid figures are the real world observations. Again, the average is way above real world observations. Now, what this means is that whatever theories, whatever hypotheses, whatever guesses about how the whole climate system reacts to added carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, whatever theories inform those models must be wrong. The Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman, in a very famous quip that is available on YouTube in a number of different places. Just Google for Feynman and key to science. It says, look, the key to science is this. When we want to know how something in nature works, first we make a guess. Then we make predictions of what we should see in the real world if our guess is correct. Then we actually look in the real world and we see what we see. And he says, if our observations contradict our predictions, then our guess, our theory, our hypothesis is wrong. And it doesn't matter how smart we are or how beautiful our guess is, and I would add, or how many people agree with it. If the observations contradict the predictions, the guess is wrong. And you have to go back to the drawing board. Unfortunately, the folks behind climate alarmism are not doing that. They are not doing true science. And they're ignoring CO2's really big effect. CO2's big effect is not on global average temperature. It is instead on plant growth. This is an AI overview after a Google search on, quote, increased vegetative cover from CO2, and AI yielded this. According to a 2016 study published in Nature Climate Change, rising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have led to significant greening of 25 to 50% of the Earth's vegetated lands over the past 35 years. This greening is equivalent to an increase in leaves on plants and trees that's twice the size of the continental United States. The study estimates that 70% of the extra green growth is due to rising CO2 levels. So in other words, we've got 70% of twice the size of the United States. So that would be the equivalent of 140% of the continental United States. That's the vegetation added to the world by CO2 since what was it? The past 35 years. Well, how does increased CO2 affect plants and the people and critters who depend on them? Well, every doubling of CO2 concentration causes an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency, better growth in warmer and cooler temperatures, better growth in wetter and drier soils, better use of soil nutrients, and better resistance to diseases and pests. Consequently, plants expand their geographic range, which means that all the critters that depend on them can expand their geographic range too. They produce more food for everything that depends on them, which means that there's more food for all those critters that depend on them, which then means that there's reduced risk of species extinction. If you think that we're facing the possibility of the 6th great extinction, which, by the way, is another thing that comes from modeling, but not from real-world observation. If you're fearful of species extinction, you should be really pleased to see more CO2 in the atmosphere, causing plants to grow more and to grow in more places, because that reduces the strain on species to get the food they need. And finally, and from our perspective as Christians who want to do what Paul says in Galatians 2:10, he was already ready to do, which is to remember the poor, this makes more food available for the world's poor. Now, I might mention that there are some studies that show that some crops reduce their nutrient value per kilogram of harvest, okay? Some crops do that. Some others actually slightly increase theirs. For plenty, there's no significant change, but the increase in the total volume or total weight harvested more than makes up for the decrease in nutritive value per amount. So, granted that with declining scarcity of food, the price of food goes down, it's very easy to make up for the slight change in nutrient density by eating a little bit more or changing the diet. More CO2 means more food for the poor. My friend Craig Idso of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change back in 2013 published this study in which he said that a quantitative estimate of the direct monetary benefits conferred by atmospheric CO2 enrichment on both historic and future global crop production shows that the annual total monetary value of this benefit grew from $18.5 billion in 1961 to over $140 billion by 2011, amounting to a total sum of $3.2 trillion over the 50-year period. Projecting the monetary value of this positive externality forward in time, assuming continued increase in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere per the predictions from the IPCC, reveals it will likely bestow an additional $9.8 trillion on crop production between now and 2050. Okay, so is man-made climate change an existential threat? The IPCC in 2018 published its special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. On page 256, it said this: under the no policy baseline scenario, temperature rises by 3.66 degrees Celsius, and that's from before the Industrial Revolution. That would mean about 2.46 degrees Celsius from 2018. It rises by that by 2100, resulting in a GWP, that's gross world product, loss of 2.6%. Okay, well, all right, do we really want to lose 2.6% of gross world product? Well, it doesn't sound great, does it? But think about what gross world product will likely be in 2100. The Center for Global Development projects average 3.1% annual GWP growth to 2100. That would go up to 9.03 times the present gross world product. By the way, that's a pretty standard answer. It's quite central, sort of an estimate. And in fact, it's about what the 20th century average was, despite 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Barring some similar Great World War or something, much bigger indeed, I think it's entirely reasonable to expect that kind of economic growth through the rest of this century. Now, the UN Population Division forecasts that population will rise to about 10.3 billion in 2100. So, unrestricted climate change. Now, remember, this is under the no baseline policy scenario. Pardon me, the no policy baseline scenario, which in IPCC speak means we do absolutely nothing to try to slow or stop global warming, right? Under that no policy baseline scenario, we will reduce 2100's GWP by about 2.6%. And that would mean that people would be about 8.8 times richer than today instead of about 9.03 times. Poverty is a greater threat than climate and weather, and the poor gain faster than the rich. At the same time as all of this is going on, the gap between rich and poor nations will actually shrink. So, graphed, just using exponential to reflect the 3.1% annual GWP growth, from 2018 to 2100, GWP per capita would rise from about $13,991 in 2018 to $126,356 per capita in 2100 if there were no global warming. But with global warming and without any efforts to slow it, instead, GWP per capita would rise to about $123,071, 8.8 times what it was before instead of 9.03 times what it was before. I have a hard time thinking that that's an existential threat, particularly because since poverty is the greater risk than anything related to climate, we must expect human well-being to improve dramatically over that time. All right, and nonetheless, the movement demands that we achieve net zero CO2 emissions. That is, balancing our emissions with what we artificially extract from the atmosphere. And to defend that idea, John Kerry, who at the time was President Biden's special envoy for climate issues, John Kerry said a 2-degree future could result, notice that word, by the way, could. That's always an interesting thing. Well, if it could, well, maybe it could also not. But a 2-degree future could result in another 600 million people not getting enough to eat. Well, life is full of trade-offs. That's one of the basic lessons from economists. Let's think about those trade-offs. Bjorn Lomborg, the head of the Copenhagen Consensus Center and a leading world environmental economist and developmental economist, said, half the world's population entirely depends on food grown with synthetic fertilizer produced almost entirely by natural gas. If we rapidly ceased using fossil fuels, 4 billion people would suddenly be without food. By the way, what happens when you're without food is that over a fairly short time, you die. Additional billions of people depend on fossil fuels for heat, steel, cement, plastics, and transportation. Eliminating fossil fuels, which John Kerry wants, would mean depriving people of all those things too. So, Lomborg concludes, citing a study by economist Neil Record, the result would be around 6 billion deaths combined. So, achieving net zero might protect those 600 million people, but it will lead to 6 billion deaths. What seems better? What's the trade-off there? And just simply in terms of monetary cost, Lomborg calculates, and he's using UN data for this, achieving net zero would cost an average $27 trillion per year from now to the end of the century, at which the annual cost would have risen to about $60 trillion per year. Those costs far outweigh any costs from climate change itself. So what gives? Why does the catastrophist narrative prevail? Well, there are a whole lot of different reasons, political reasons, and so on. I'll get to a few of those later. But for a moment, let's just think about the control of who gets published and who doesn't about climate change. Patrick T. Brown, a climate scientist of the Johns Hopkins University Climate Center, wrote back in September of last year, I just got published in Nature because I stuck to a narrative I knew the editors would like. That's not the way science should work. He also published similarly on the Free Press. I left out the full truth to get my climate change paper published. Brown told of what he called the 4 points that were a success formula for climate change publishing. First, you mention an impact of climate change, but you ignore other contributors. For instance, lots of things other than climate change, wildfire risk, or climate other than climate change influence wildfire risk. But mentioning them downplays the role of climate change. And the narrative is that climate change is an existential threat. So nothing must be said that downplays it if you want to get published in the premier peer-reviewed journals. Second, you ignore or downplay the actions, adaptation, that can negate the impact. We could, for instance, greatly reduce wildfire risk by different forest management practices, and that would reduce fuel for the fires, which would reduce the fire's heat and rapidity of spread. Third, you focus on impressive, but not necessarily enlightening, numbers. In this case, Brown explained, you talk about risk because you can come up with some very, very impressive looking numbers about that, rather than acres burned or increase in intensity, which doesn't yield such impressive numbers. And fourth, you ignore complicating or contradictory evidence. For example, the fact that while climate change or climate warming since the 1800s might increase wildfire, other factors like societal changes in population distribution, infrastructure, behavior, disaster preparedness, etc., have had far more influence on our sensitivity to weather extremes than climate change has since the 1880s, or the 1800s, rather. So, this is the case. You essentially cannot get published now in leading refereed journals if you clearly challenge the notion of catastrophic climate change. So what that means is that plenty of scientists who don't believe in that write not necessarily as if they do, but certainly concealing the fact that they don't embrace that. So it's not about the science, and it never has been. Dr. David Legates, in chapter 2 of our book, Climate and Energy, the Case for Realism, has extensive discussion of this with plenty of documentation, but I'll give you a couple of things right here. Ottmar Edenhofer, who was the co-chair of the UN IPCC in 2010, said in the lead up to the climate summit in Cancun, he said, "The climate summit in Cancun at the end of the month is not a climate conference, but one of the largest economic conferences since the Second World War. One must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." Or you have Christiana Figueres, Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, at a news conference in 2015, leading up to the Paris Climate Summit, at which the Paris Agreement was adopted. She said, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution." Now, her father, Jose Figueres Ferrer, was president of Costa Rica from 1953 to 58. He was a self-described farmer socialist with the National Liberation Party who led a deeper and more human revolution than that of Cuba, while nationalizing the banking industry. And Christiana Figueres is herself a socialist as well. What she sees as the real goal of all of these climate summits and the UN IPCC and the Framework Convention is replacing capitalism or global free trade with global socialism, global governance and control of the economy. So again, I'll recommend to you our book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism. It was an Amazon bestseller in energy policy and environmental policy for the first, in fact, it was number 1 or number 2 in those 2 different categories for about the first month that it came out. And it's been continuing as a top seller in those categories ever since. And you can get that from cornwallalliance.org/shop. And I do want to recommend the book that Don showed, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. She documents how a variety of different evangelical leaders and their organizations embraced progressive leftist ideas, including on creation care and especially climate change, because they were induced either with cash payments or with access to high-profile organizations and publishing opportunities. I can tell you, for example, that the Evangelical Environmental Network was started in the early 1990s, I believe it was 1994, as one of 4 parts of the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Tides Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, and various others, all of them committed to supporting population control and unrestricted abortion in the United States and all over the world. Those funded the start of the National Religious Partnership. The Evangelical Environmental Network was the evangelical branch of that. And ever since then, it has received large portions of its funding from such organizations, including some channeled through ultimately from George Soros. What I am really glad to be able to tell you is that in this chapter on climate change, the author Megan Basham writes very, very complimentarily of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. She says that we have stood in strong opposition to that and have maintained our integrity, unlike some of these others. So there you go, the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We try to bridge humanity and the environment through faith and reason. We want to educate the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. We want to help people to pursue godly dominion, enhancing the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. So addressing the 2 great commandments to love God and to love neighbor. We are trying to save the planet from the people who are trying to save the planet. And you can learn more about us by going to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org.